there, welcome back. Ever wonder how the US Army, being the largest branch of the US military, how do they manage to operate so effectively? I mean, think about it from crazy battlefields to those complex peacekeeping missions all over the globe.
It's quite a feat, isn't it?
It really is. And that's what we're diving into today, the very framework that guides their every decision, every Action Army Doctrine Publication 101, or ADP 101 for short.
Their playbook, their strategic code, you could say. And we're going to break it down, peel back those layers so you understand not just the what, but the why behind it all.
I love that, uncovering the why. Now, ADP 101, it kicks off by defining doctrine. And I'll admit, sometimes military jargon, it can be a bit much. So in a practical sense, what does this really mean?
You're right. It's not just about fancy terms.
Yeah.
Imagine this. You're a young officer out in the field, facing a situation, a complex one. You need guidance, and fast. Doctrine that's your trusted advisor in those moments. It draws on centuries, literally centuries of hard-won experience to provide that framework for making decisions, sound decisions, even when things are at their most chaotic.
So it's like having access to, this collective wisdom of military minds across history, all distilled into this actionable guidance.
Exactly. And here's the fascinating part. It's not static. This thing's constantly evolving, incorporating lessons learned from every recent conflict, adapting to these new technologies and threats that pop up. It's a living document shaped by real-world experience.
That's got to be what makes it so powerful, that adaptability. Now, Chapter 2, it dives into the structure of this living document, right? Breaking down those core components of doctrine. Principles, tactics, techniques, procedures. Feels like we're unpacking a military toolkit here.
And just like any good toolkit, knowing which tool to use for the job at hand, that's crucial. And that's where ADP 101 gets really interesting, I think, especially for those of you fascinated by decision-making, those high-pressure situations. It distinguishes between, and this is key, descriptive versus prescriptive information.
Okay, unpack that for us a bit. What's the difference, and why is it so important, especially if you're trying to understand how military leaders think?
Think of it this way. Prescriptive. That's non-negotiable. Adhering to the law of war, for example. These are the rules, must be followed no matter what. Descriptive, on the other hand, that offers more flexibility, yeah? It allows leaders to adapt tactics and strategies to the situation at hand, because no two situations are exactly alike, right?
So knowing when to follow those hard and fast rules versus when to adapt, when to improvise, that's a crucial skill for any leader, really, military or otherwise. It's knowing when to trust your gut. And that kind of leads us to Chapter 3, where ADP 101 really dives headfirst into the Army's view of warfare. And it's not just about, tanks and battalions, is it?
Not at all, no. You see, the U.S. Army, they recognize that warfare, it's more than just armies clashing. It's wills clashing, often playing out against this backdrop of really complex human dynamics, with civilian populations often caught right in the middle.
Right. It's about understanding that every battlefield, it's also someone's home, someone's community. That adds a whole other layer of complexity to military operations. So how does ADP 101 equip leaders to navigate all of that?
It emphasizes three core concepts: combined arms operations, mission command, and this unwavering adherence to the law of war. And, let's take a closer look at each of these because they are essential to understanding how the U.S. Army operates. First, you've got combined arms operations, and this stresses how important it is to leverage every tool in your arsenal. We're not just talking tanks and infantry here, but air power, cyber capabilities, even psychological operations. It's about orchestrating all these elements like a symphony of force to achieve those decisive results.
So it's not just about having a diverse toolkit, it's about knowing how to use all those tools together, in concert, like you said, a symphony of force, to create that force multiplier effect.
You got it. Now, imagine you're a commander out in the field, facing a situation, a fluid one, it's rapidly changing, the enemy's adapting, and you need your troops to be able to make those split-second decisions, right? That's where mission command comes in. Instead of trying to micromanage every single decision from the top down, you empower those subordinates, those lower-level leaders, to take initiative, but within the framework of your overall intent, of course.
It's about trusting those who are closest to the action to make the right call in the heat of the moment, because they often have the best understanding of what's actually happening on the ground, right? But that requires exceptional leadership and a deep-rooted culture of trust within the ranks.
Absolutely. And finally, underpinning everything the U.S. Army does is this unwavering commitment to the law of war. Even in the chaos of battle, there are lines that cannot be crossed. These ethical considerations, they must guide every decision.
It's about being ethically responsible, even in the face of danger, and understanding those nuanced concepts, it is critical. But Chapter 4, it takes us on this journey into, well, the language of operations. It's like learning a whole new language.
It is. It really is a whole new language, the language of military operations. We're not asking for coffee here. We're talking about coordinating those complex maneuvers, strategically deploying resources. And ADP 101, it lays out some key terms like domain.
Okay, domain, what's that
So
encompass?
domain, think land, air, sea, space, cyberspace, basically. Everywhere, anywhere a military operation might have to take place.
It's interesting how that battle space has expanded so much, even beyond like physical borders. We're fighting wars in cyberspace now, not just on land. That requires a whole different, well, playbook, doesn't it? Different tactics.
Absolutely, a whole different ballgame in many ways. And then you've got the operational environment. And this one is not just about the physical terrain, it's those human dynamics we were talking about earlier.
Right, the political climate, the cultures involved.
Exactly, the cultural landscape, even things like perceptions and motivations of the people caught in the middle of it all.
Understanding the human terrain just as much as the physical one. So how do you even begin to make sense of all these different factors, these moving parts? That's where those warfighting functions come in, right?
You got it. Warfighting functions, think of them as the overarching capabilities, the ones that allow the U.S. Army to operate effectively in that complex operational environment we were just talking about.
Okay, so we're talking about those core competencies that underpin every military operation. Break those down for us, because I think this is where ADP 101 really gets into, like, the nuts and bolts of how the Army actually functions.
Absolutely. ADP 101, it outlines 6 key warfighting functions. They are mission command, movement and maneuver, intelligence, fires, sustainment, and protection. And each one, it plays a critical role. Think of them, I don't know, like gears in a machine, all working together to achieve that common goal.
I like that analogy, those gears. Okay, so let's break it down, starting with mission command. Seems to be a recurring theme in our deep dive here. What's so special about this function?
So mission command, this is really the glue, holds everything together. It's about that decentralization of decision-making, right?
Yeah.
Empowering those lower-level leaders to take initiative, to adapt to those rapidly changing situations they might be facing on the ground. Remember our discussion on descriptive versus prescriptive doctrine.
I do, yeah.
This is where that adaptability really comes into play.
Okay, so if mission command is like the brain of the operation, then movement and maneuver, this is about putting that plan into action, physically moving troops and equipment, getting that strategic advantage on the battlefield.
You got it. Agility, speed, and the ability to outmaneuver the enemy, whether it's an offensive or a defensive operation. But here's the thing. You can't maneuver effectively if you don't know what your enemy is doing. And that's where intelligence comes in.
Makes sense.
Gathering information, analyzing it, getting it to the right people at the right time, all of that to support decision-making at every level.
Information is key in any conflict. Knowing where your enemy is, their strengths and weaknesses, heck, even what they might be planning next, that's huge.
Absolutely. And then you've got fires. Now, this is a military term. Essentially, it's about delivering effects lethal and non-lethal on the enemy.
So we're talking about everything from like artillery strikes to cyber attacks.
You got it, and everything in between. All carefully coordinated, of course, to have the maximum impact. But none of that matters. None of it if your troops don't have what they need to fight, right?
Right.
If they're running low on supplies that are not equipped properly, and that's where sustainment comes in.
The unsung hero logistics.
That's it, the logistical backbone of any military operation.
Yeah.
Making sure those troops have food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, everything they need to operate effectively.
Uh-huh.
And remember, they could be thousands of miles from home. It's about maintaining that lifeline of support no matter what.
It's the unsung hero, like you said, the logistical wizardry that keeps those gears turning. But you got to keep those gears safe too, which is where protection comes in.
Exactly. Protection. This is about all those measures, everything you do to safeguard your forces and minimize casualties. We're talking about enemy action, sure, but also accidents, disease, you name it. Minimizing risk, anticipating threats, and creating that secure environment for your troops to operate in.
So we've got our 6 warfighting functions, these core capabilities, all interconnected, interdependent, like that well-oiled machine, each part crucial for the overall success of the operation. But how does ADP 101 address, like, that connection between those high-level strategic goals, you know, the big picture stuff, and the boots-on-the-ground actions? That's where levels of warfare come in.
Yeah, levels of warfare. It's like, picture a pyramid, right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
So at the top, you've got the strategic level. This encompasses those big picture goals, the entire nation's goals. Things like, deterring adversaries, protecting national interests.
So if we're thinking back to that pyramid, that very top, that's where you've got the president, the highest levels of government, right?
Exactly. They set those overarching national objectives, provide that strategic guidance for any military action.
They're playing on that global chessboard, aren't they? Considering all the different pieces, diplomatic, economic, military.
That's it, all the instruments of national power.
Hmm.
Now, let's move down that pyramid to the operational level of warfare. This is where those broad strategic objectives, they start to get translated into, well, more tangible military goals.
It's that bridge then between those high-level decisions and the actual actions taking place on the ground.
Think of it this way. You'll find commanders at this level, and they're planning and executing those large-scale campaigns, major operations. They're figuring out how to maneuver those military pieces on that chessboard, so to speak, to achieve the objectives set at the strategic level.
Okay, so they're taking that national strategy, turning it into a concrete military plan, allocating resources, directing the movement of troops, I mean, sometimes across entire theaters of operation.
It's a massive undertaking. And it's all about winning those battles, those campaigns that ultimately contribute to achieving those, overarching strategic goals set at the very top.
Got it. So then at the base of our pyramid, we reach that tactical level of warfare. This is where, as they say, the rubber meets the road. Yeah.
Exactly. Individual battles, those engagements are fought.
So we're talking platoons maneuvering under fire, tanks, engaging enemy positions, special forces conducting those daring raids. It's the stuff we often picture, right, when we think about warfare.
That's it. It's about executing those missions that, when successful, directly contribute to those operational goals, the ones set by those commanders at the level above. Remember those warfighting functions we talked about?
As you do.
This is where they really come to life.
It all connects. So you've got those troops on the ground, relying on intelligence to understand the enemy, using fires to suppress enemy positions, sustainment to keep those supply lines open, and all while operating within that mission command framework. It all comes together.
And those tactical victories, even the small ones, those seemingly insignificant wins, they all contribute to that bigger operational picture, which, like we said, helps achieve those grand national strategic objectives.
It's fascinating how ADP 101 it really connects those dots, showing how each level of warfare, from, like you said, the foxhole to the Oval Office, they're all interconnected, playing a role in achieving those national security goals.
It's about having that shared understanding, that common framework for how the Army operates, making sure everyone, no matter their rank, understands how their actions contribute to that big picture.
Like a well-coordinated dance, everybody moving in sync towards that shared objective. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the very definition of doctrine, then got into those core principles that guide how the U.S. Army approaches warfare, all through the lens of ADP 101. So, as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners, what do you want them to walk away with?
I think the biggest one is this ADP 101. It's not just some dry military document, right? It's a living, breathing testament to just how much warfare has evolved, how it continues to evolve.
It's got to be adaptable for that very reason, to stay relevant.
Exactly. It's a framework. It helps leaders at all levels navigate the complexities of modern conflict. It guides them in making sound, ethical decisions, even in the most incredibly challenging situations.
It's about empowering those closest to the action, knowing when and how to adapt, understanding that human cost of war, and never ever straying from those core values that define, what it means to be a part of the U.S. Army.
I wouldn't have said it better myself. And for anyone out there, if you're diving into ADP 101 for the first time, don't be intimidated. It's complex, yes, but embrace that challenge. Ask questions, be curious, and most importantly, think critically about the ideas and concepts presented.
Don't just read it, wrestle with it.
Exactly, because at its heart, ADP 101, it's not about memorizing rules. It's about understanding that art of warfare, developing those critical thinking skills, and ultimately becoming a more effective leader.
That's a fantastic takeaway. This deep dive, it has been an incredible journey into, like we said, the strategic minds of the U.S. Army. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpacked ADP 101. And to our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.